The grieving widower woke from his dream to a tapping sound on his window. And when he opened his eyes, he saw his wife standing in the shrubs outside of his house. She was staring into his room, and she was staring past him to the crib, to their newborn infant son. And this woman, his wife, had graveyard dirt in her matted hair, and her dead eyes would not move from that infant. Now, this is the story of the Irish zombie Momma who returned from the grave to feed her infant child. I am going to warn you now, if you are under the age of 13, please click away. This video is not for you. I'm Aloysius. I am the owner of Haunted Harbor Tours, and welcome. These stories involving fairies and mothers who return from the grave, and all of the different way in which fairy tried to steal a baby are told in many, many, many folklores. This particular incarnation comes originally from A Haunted Land, Ireland's Ghost, by Bob Curran. It seems to be a bit of barroom folklore. I have adapted this story from Bob Curran's version. The ending is a little bit different, and quite a bit of the story is changed. A link to this book is going to be provided in the video, in the description below. And also, please, please, please like, comment, and subscribe. I am trying to grow my audience. And with that, we are going to open with a small town in Northern Ireland, literally just an intersection. To the north is a tavern, and to the west is a row of homes where I believe the woodcutter Peter had his home, and to the south is a Catholic church. And that's literally all there is to Arney. It is an intersection on your way into Northern Ireland. I've looked it up on Google Maps. It is a fantastically abandoned town. But that's probably the way it was throughout most of Irish history. And even this folklore story seems to use the same map that Google Maps is doing. Now, this story involves a woodcutter named Peter, who eventually took a young, beautiful wife, a woman with very luscious, large red hair. She, was fair in complexion, and she also had a bit of a limp. One of her legs was shorter than the other. Now, this woman was a very affectionate and kind person. However, the folks of this town believed she was of the fairy kin. There was something about her that said, well, this person's either a witch or part fairy. And so they treated her with a little bit of apprehension, a little bit of hesitation. She's not one of us, man. She's kind of different. She, after a couple of years of being together, she began to show, right? Her belly began to grow. People began to notice her belly growing. And it wasn't long after that Peter was going around saying to everybody he saw, I'm going to be a daddy. I am so excited. I'm going to be a fucking father. And I will tell you, I am sure that is an incredible experience. The firstborn child, right? So the day comes. The baby is born. And it is a beautiful, bouncing baby boy. Unfortunately, the mother does not make it. And Peter's grieving. Also, he has a small infant that he must take care of. And so the town takes it upon themselves to make arrangements for the funeral of this mother. And they do this by shipping her up north, all the way up Arney Road, all the way about 4 or 5 miles to a town up north, a larger township. And Peter takes on many hats. He becomes the caregiver for this child. He's also working all day as his woodcutter job, and he's doing everything. And he becomes focused on caring for this child as this way to grieve. And about a week passes when he wakes from his slumber at the sound of tapping on the glass. And when he opens his eyes, he sees his wife standing in the window of this room. And she is not looking at him, she is looking beyond him to the infant child in the crib. His wife is pale, and there are bugs running across her face. Her red hair is matted with graveyard dirt. And he walks up to the window, and he sees not a shimmer of light in her eyes. It is cold and soulless and vacant, without any shred of humanity. And he realizes this isn't his wife. This is an Irish zombie mama. In this moment, he thinks, this is a woman possessed by fairies. This is the corpse of my wife, taken by fairies, and it's come to take my child. Now, in Irish folklore, this is not uncommon, right? Fairies tend to want to perpetuate their entertainment and their happiness and even their population by bringing in human children and human women and getting as many people to come and get stuck in whatever kind of weird land they have and imprison them. In fact, typically children in myth and folklore are stolen and replaced with a changeling, right? Something that will make a fair trade, right? A fairy will take a frog, make it take the form of a child. It will then steal the child, leave the changeling in the bed. But of course, this is a frog or a rotted log or, any number of other natural things that aren't supposed to be a kid. And so it becomes sickly and it begins to rot away. Now, if you do care for this changeling child, right, if you embrace it, if you care for it, if you feed it, then the contract is sealed and the fairy gets to off with your baby. And that's just the way it is. That's a fair contract according to the fairy folk. And so he recognizes this for what it is, or what he, according to Irish folklore, this North Irish kind of idea, this is what he comes to. This is a fairy that is possessing the corpse of my dead wife, and it has come here to take my child. And then she moves away from the window, and he hears the footsteps as she moves through the bushes and begins to go around what I imagine is a small shack and over to the kitchen door. And he thinks to himself, oh, please, I know I locked that door. Please let that door be locked. And he hears the door kind of jimmy and jostle, and he's like, oh, okay. And he closes his bedroom door, and he leans against it. And all of a sudden, he hears a loud crash. The door and the jamb have split open, and the impact of this Irish zombie mama, I love saying that. And she is now in his kitchen, and he hears her going through the cabinets, right? And he hears her munching on some of his bread and cheese. And eventually the footsteps on the floorboard leading to his room going down the hall, he hears the creaking of the floors, right? The creaking of the floors, and they get louder and louder as she gets closer and closer and closer and closer until she's right at the door, right? I would say he could hear her breathing, but she was silent, completely silent, not a breath in her lungs. But he can see, the dark shadow coming in the crack of the door, and through just a sliver, right? These are pieces of wood that have been formed together to make wood from this woodcutter. And he can see her eyes staring in, looking past him and again at the crib. And he starts to pray, and he says, please don't come in here. Please don't come in here. If you still love your child, please go back home. And she turns, and she leaves the house, and she heads back. And he looks through the window, and he sees her walking down the dirt road to where she was buried. And so he goes to bed, and he prays that this will be the end of it. Please let this woman never appear again. And the next night, he again awakes. Now, He hears the tapping at the window, right? The scratching at his window. But he goes to the window and he doesn't see his wife, right? And he goes to check on his kid. And again, he hears the scratching at the window, and he turns around, and there she is, right on the window, right staring right back at him. Again, even paler now, right? Her hair is a little bit longer, there's more dirt in her hair, and she's still staring right at that kid, right at that baby. And he knows she's after this. This is what she wants. She wants this baby. And he hears her again go through the bushes and go around to the back of the house. And again, she smashes open. Well, he fixed the door and tried to make it even stronger, but she goes right in. And again, he hears her approaching and getting closer and getting closer. He begins to pray, right? Please, 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 God, send her away. Don't let her break down this door. Like, please, if you love your child, please head back. Do not come in here. And then there's a smash into the door, right? And the splinters begin to come off, and the latch begins to give, and another smash, right? And he's praying, but it's not working. So he opens up the door and he says, "Baby, we can make this work. You know, so you're an undead creature of unimaginable horror, and you're trying to steal my baby. But, you know, other people have made relationships worse off than us work. I'm sure we can get past this." Sorry, I'm just kidding. Zombie relationships are the worst. And once a relationship is dead, it's best to just cap that zombie relationship right in the head and move on with your life. Relationships that have died are best buried. Anyway, so he opens up the door and says, "Get out of here. Go. You shouldn't be here. Please leave." And staring her right in the eyes, she doesn't have an emotional reaction, but she does stiffen up, and she looks away from the baby for just an instant. And in that instant, she turns, and she begins to walk into the kitchen. And he stands in the kitchen, and he watches her as she begins to devour his food. And finally, she makes her exit. And he doesn't know how much more of this he can take. He can't do this every night until this kid goes off to college, or does whatever he's eventually going to do. And so the next day he goes to the priest. And he goes to the Catholic priest. He visits him at his home, and he says, "Father, you gotta help me. Like, I can't take much more of this. This is seriously weighing on me. You would think a priest is here for the good against evil, right? Standing up against the undead, the vampires, you would think that's exactly what a priest, is signed on to do. But this one is, he's afraid of this. He doesn't want to mess with any undead thing. And he says, well, I tell you what, I'll do the best thing I can do for your wife. I'll pray to God in the church, right? And I'll ask him to protect you. But here, have a crucifix, right? This'll help." And so he hands over this crucifix to this grieving, pained father who's being visited by his dead wife every night. Now, other people are beginning to see her too at night as she comes. A man is walking to the pub, and he passes her on the other side of the street. And he almost instinctively calls to her to say hello, but then he recoils when he realizes this is a dead woman. And he takes a look at her, and her long leg, her limpy leg, is now dragging as she moves. Her skin is almost breaking out into cuts and lacerations. Her long hair is now just matted and dreadlocked with graveyard dirt and, things and lice and all of these insects crawling in and out of it. Her black dress is torn, and her feet are just covered in graveyard dirt with no shoes. A young girl is looking out her window and sees this ghastly horror approaching, and the whole town begins to murmur of poor Peter the woodcutter's visitations, nightly visitors coming and trying to steal his baby. Peter, frustrated. The crucifix seemed to have some kind of, like, the first couple of nights she stopped at prayer. She hesitated with prayer, but it didn't seem to work, and he knew what to do next. You see, there were some people who also had fairy people kind of connections in this area. And he goes off to a lake, and he finds a woman who is said to be visited by fairies at night, an old hag. Nightly, people will say that they hear the music of the fairies coming out of her hut. And she does not play any instruments, she does not have any kind of musical abilities, but for whatever reason, her hut is always blasting loud, gay music. He goes out and he goes to see this woman. Now, as he's approaching her house, he hears rustling in the bushes, and he knocks on her door, and this big old Irish Bertha, comes and opens the door, and she says, well, come in, but you can't stay long. I'm expecting guests. And he sits down and he tells her about his wife and about his nightly visits and how he's certain that she's going to steal his baby here. And he needs her help. The church isn't working alone. And she says yes. That's because the church doesn't work without a little bit of magic to help it along. Now, these two things are super powerful when together. And so what you need, let me ask you a question. Is she wearing shoes when she comes to your house? And he says, no, she's not wearing shoes. And she says, well, you see, that's the problem. They buried her without any shoes on. And it's the iron nails in a shoe that protect a body, a corpse, from being possessed by the fairy. And what you need to do is you need to expose her not to a cross, but to an iron nail. And an iron nail, the iron and the shape of it, will scare away the fairy, and it'll send her packing, and she'll never return again. So he returns from this big Bertha lady's house, and he goes into his carpentry tools, and he gets out one of the biggest nails he can find, and he turns it into a necklace, and he puts it around the baby's neck, hoping that this will protect his infant. And this time, he's ready, and he's sitting up waiting. And he looks out his bedroom window, and he's watching the street. And the sun sets, and he's just sitting there by the bedroom window, and he's waiting. And he's waiting, and he's waiting. And he's watching the road, but she never seems to show up. And that's when he hears a few creaks in his floorboards outside of his room coming down the hall. And he turns around to see his wife standing at the crib, and she takes off the nail, and smoke begins to rise from her hand as she lifts the nail delicately off of the baby's neck. She picks up the baby, and she begins to walk to the door, and he grabs her and he tears her around. Don't take my baby. And she takes what are now incredibly long nails, right? She's been decaying in this crypt, and the nails grow incredibly long, and she slashes him across the face and then pushes him into the window, and he falls into the glass, and the glass rains down upon him, causing lacerations into his chest and neck. And she leaves, and he goes to follow her, and he finds more of his food is missing, and spoiled breast milk leads out the door. And she has him now. And the cross didn't work. The fairy magic didn't work. And so he begins to work to combine the two. He uses some large nails, and he twists them, and he bends them, and he turns them into a cross, combining the fairy magic and the Christian magic. And he begins the long walk to her tomb. And when he gets there, he finds a sickly child laying in the coffin, or laying in a crib. that's inside of her tomb. A kind of makeshift crib that seems to have been rotted and decayed is sitting in the tomb, and she's sitting there singing a lullaby, right? Some strange song he had never heard before. It sounded like it came from another world. And he goes and he holds this cross and nail combination, and he holds it towards his wife, and she begins to scream at him. Right? Her face distorts, her mouth becomes long. She becomes like a wrath. And she's screaming at him, and she lunges at him, and he takes the nail and he jams it into her chest, stabbing her right in the heart. And she falls over dead. Poofs of smoke lifting up, and from her eyes, 2 bright yellow lights begin to lift into the sky, and they leave the crypt. He reaches into the coffin, and he picks up his bouncing baby boy, and he begins to care for it, wiping the grime off of its lips and carrying it home. In the comments, let me know. Do you believe he retrieved his actual child, or did he pick up something else? A changeling, perhaps. Thank you for joining me. I think that is one of the spiciest pieces of folklore. I hate folklore when it's poor, overdone, and boring, such as the Hitchhiker's Ghost. Hence why I have imbued these paintings with a beautiful property. Creepy, weepy, and Katya crawl out of their paintings every single night, and they find people telling the story of the hook-hand killer. They find people telling the story of the hitchhiker, right? Any of those stories involving Lover's Lane. And they find those people, and they mess with them, and sometimes even cause severe trauma. So don't tell those stories. Keep coming to my YouTube channel to get good, original, fun ghost stories. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, comment, turn on that bell notification. Let me know what you think in the comments. Did Peter actually get his child, or did he get a fairy changeling? Thank you all so absolutely much for joining me.